The crowd is starting to boo and they're chanting, "Let him jump!" And the police, they're telling people to start to disperse. And as they're doing this, something incredible happens. A deadly phenomenon was occurring in America. Fire departments were beginning to use these large safety nets that resembled these huge circular stretches of canvas to try to save people that were stuck in burning buildings. They would call out to the people inside to jump out of the window onto the net, breaking their fall and saving their lives. However, the deadly phenomenon was that these people who were stuck in these buildings were more afraid to make the jump onto the net than they were of the fire. And so despite the firefighters' constant urges to please just jump, they would stay put and they would die in the fire. And so fire departments all over America were desperately trying to find ways to educate the American public, but despite their efforts, Americans were still staying put in these buildings and dying unnecessarily. A diving instructor named Robert Odlum heard about this issue and he thought to himself, if Americans just maybe saw someone make the jump successfully, they wouldn't be afraid anymore. And since Robert was very comfortable jumping from heights, he thought, well, who better to make these demonstrations than me? Robert began hosting these demonstrations where he would leap out of multi-story buildings onto the safety net. And very quickly, these demonstrations began attracting very big crowds, but not because they wanted the education of the event. They just wanted to see someone jump out of a building onto a net. It was like a circus act. And Robert found himself really enjoying the attention he was garnering, and so pretty quickly he stopped doing demonstrations and instead began jumping off of huge bridges into bodies of water just because people thought it was awesome. He was becoming this celebrity in Washington, D.C. And soon, Robert began taking his show all over the country, basically touring to all these bridges all over America, and then when he would get to the bridge, there'd be hundreds and hundreds of people cheering him on. But Robert's very unlikely and rapid rise to fame and fortune quickly spawned copycats. His popularity was beginning to wane because he was no longer as unique. Robert thought to himself, you know, I gotta do something that sets me apart from all the other bridge jumpers. And it just so happened there was a bridge that had recently been constructed in New York called the Brooklyn Bridge that was massive. At its highest point, it was a whopping 130 feet off of the water. And so if Robert made that jump, he would actually set the record for the highest bridge jump ever. But by this point, bridge jumping had become popular enough that police had caught on to it and they had made it illegal. They would show up to the location on the day of the jump in force and they would stop the jumper from jumping. And so Robert knew this, but he still needed to get the word out. And so he created a very clever word of mouth campaign amongst people in New York. And he also began handing out these flyers that were fairly cryptic, but still told people where to go and at what time. Robert's underground advertising campaign had worked beautifully. By early that morning, the Brooklyn Bridge was covered with hundreds and hundreds of people. There's all these people who are all waiting to see Robert make this record-setting jump. Robert had become a bit of a showman since he began doing these bridge jumps, and he had developed a sort of trademark entrance. He would arrive in a black horse and carriage, and then once it stopped on the bridge, he would leap out, and he'd be wearing this long coat, and he would take it off, revealing his swimsuit, and the crowd would cheer, and then he would wave to the crowd, and then he would just run to the edge and leap off the bridge. All these people who are waiting for Robert, they're looking for this black horse and carriage, and around noontime, someone spotted it. Once it stopped on the bridge, the door flung open, and Robert leapt out in his big coat. He ripped his coat off, revealing his swimsuit. The crowd was going wild. Everyone was so pumped about this. He's waving and getting ready, and he starts running to the railing to make this jump, and before he jumps, the police swarm him and arrest him. The police were not dumb. They had caught on to this underground advertising campaign, and so like everyone else, they were out in force on this bridge. There were all these officers everywhere. The crowd is starting to boo, and they're chanting, "Let him jump! Let him jump!" And the police, they're telling people to start to disperse, and as they're doing this, something incredible happens. On the far other side of the bridge, another black horse and carriage had just come to a stop on the bridge. The doors had flung open, and a man had jumped out wearing a long coat. He had ripped it off, revealing a swimsuit, and the crowd went wild. it was the real Robert Odlum. The man the police had arrested was actually an actor that Robert had paid to pretend to be him. Robert had told him to show up at a particular time and make the typical entrance that he would in order to suck all the police to that side of the bridge, and then while that was happening, Robert would show up and have enough time and space to make the jump. And his plan had worked perfectly. And so the police, they see this happening and they realize there's no way they can run all the way across the bridge and stop Robert before he makes the jump. And so, like everyone else, they just kind of walked to the railing and they watched. And so the real Robert, he runs over to the railing, he climbs onto the other side, and he's looking out over the water, and he gives one more wave, and then he jumps. Onlookers would later say that at first his jump was perfect. As soon as he leapt off the bridge, like he always did, he put his right arm straight over his head and he tucked his left arm by his side. This allowed him to stay in an upright vertical position as he fell. But just a second into his fall, a strong gust of wind blew Robert off his axis, and suddenly he was falling on his side. Bridge jumpers, when they jump from really high heights, they need to land feet first in a vertical position. This allows their feet to, quote, break the surface tension of the water before the rest of their body comes crashing down. And if they do it that way, it will break the jumper's fall and save their life. But if the jumper lands at basically any other angle, the water tension will not break fast enough before the rest of their body hits the surface of the water, and so the water will actually function like concrete. So after this gust of wind had blown Robert onto his side, he began flailing in midair to try to get himself back to his upright vertical position, but he couldn't do it in time, and so he slammed into the water directly on his right side. And when the crowd saw this, they figured something was wrong, but they didn't really know, and so everyone just kind of gasped and waited to see what would happen next. And they're looking, and then finally Robert emerges from the deep, except he's face down and he's motionless. And so some of Robert's friends who were on a boat below, they leapt into the water, they swam over to Robert, they pulled him back to the boat, they got him up on the deck, and when they looked at him, he looked awful. He was barely conscious, and he would just say to them, "Did I make a good jump?" And then he would die. An autopsy would reveal that Robert's impact with the surface of the water had basically obliterated all of his insides. Amongst other things, his liver, his spleen, and both his kidneys had ruptured, and all of the ribs on his right side were broken. A year later, another bridge jumper named Larry Donovan would make the jump off of the Brooklyn Bridge and survive, setting the record for the highest bridge jump at the time. Just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.